lockdown approach. Well, joining me in studio now is one of the researchers on that study, Dr. Oren Avram, a postdoctoral researcher at TAU. And Oren, thanks for joining us. First of all, let's talk about how the study was conducted. Quite interesting, because utilized data from cell phone tracking, something that's been a little controversial in Israel, but not in Israel per se, in other countries.
Yeah, so back then in April, many countries experienced lockdown in different levels of strictness, including Israel. And my colleagues and I were wondering whether this the strictness of the lockdown is a critical factor to predict the number of deaths by the end of the first wave, and especially in the light of the socioeconomic harm it causes. Right. So what we did in order to answer this question is we collected the Apple mobility data, which is mobility data that was collected from iPhone users from all around the world. And using this, it reflects somehow how many movement or how many mobility was in the country in a specific day, in every day since 2020 started. And using this data, we were able to extract different characteristics of the lockdown in many countries all around the world. So, for example, we extracted the social distancing start time, the lockdown strictness, and the lockdown duration. And what we tried to do is to measure whether there is a statistical correlation between these characteristics to the number of deaths by the end of the wave.
Right. So I'm gathering the conclusion is that in countries, it wasn't the factor whether there was that in countries where they had this sort of total lockdown or lack of mobility, that you saw less deaths there. It was more a factor of what degree, even though people may be moving around, whether they were keeping social distancing. Is that correct?
Exactly. So what we found is that the most predictive characteristic for the number of deaths is the social distancing start time with respect to the outburst of the pandemic. The more surprising conclusion was that we couldn't detect any connection between the lockdown strictness nor its duration and the number of deaths. That is, it doesn't matter if the lockdown is super strict or moderate, the number of mortality will be roughly the same.
Right. So some things like intercity travel, not really a factor, but how people may be close to each other or observing social distancing. But let me ask you, your country, this was European countries, correct, that largely you were looking at. But this, in order to rely on social distancing restrictions, you really just have to trust the population to follow them.
Of course.
So that raises the question of, for example, culturally, are Israel's going to maintain social distancing and without a lockdown just on their own, that can be trusted to do it?
That's an interesting point, and indeed a main assumption is that people follow the rules and follow the instruction or regulations. Right.
Lockdowns, Israel should maybe move out of lockdowns? Is that what this report is saying?
So I don't want to make any uncareful hypothesis, but based on our data, what we were able to see is that probably on the first wave of the corona in Israel, we could have taken a less stringent lockdown and get the same similar amounts of mortality in Israel.
Right. Well, some people are going to be happy to hear that moving out. Dr. Oren Avram from Tel Aviv University, thank you for that.
Thank you so much.